It has been a busy day testing and reviewing the new Mac Studio that I've just received. This is going to be the first of many real-world benchmark review with an emphasis on photography apps. Because I am a photographer and I also have many more Mac Studio coming in, so as soon as they arrive, I'll be running some tests on them and also be publishing a result. Make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. For now, let's jump right into this very first Mac Studio review and also real-world benchmark. Let's find out what I think about it. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Many of you have been eagerly waiting for this. If you're new, welcome. If you have followed the channel, you will know that this is going to be information dense. When we arrive at the result from the benchmark, I highly encourage you to pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself and see how this machine performs against other Mac. Let's first talk about the Apple Studio display, which will be arriving soon. The moment I get it, I'll be doing a testing and also reviewing this display from a perspective of a photographer who prints his work. I make album, I make prints all the time, so color accuracy, color uniformity, and all those aspects are going to be extremely important to me, so we're going to talk about that. Let's look at the build for the Mac Studio that I have received in. This is the first of many, like I've said, but for this one, I have just gotten a base configuration Mac Studio. M1 Max, 10 CPU, 24 GPU, with 32 gigabytes of memory and a 512 gigabyte SSD. So this is going to be a really great machine for photographers to use because on even the base model, Apple is putting a really good performance chip inside the machine, which is really awesome. Here are some potential future models that I may be getting in. So for sure, in a few days, I'll be receiving the top M1 Ultra, and I'll be reviewing that. I'll be testing it out, and I'll share with you the result fairly soon. I am still debating, but I think I'm also going to get another M1 Ultra, the 20-core CPU and 48-core GPU, because I think this is going to be the configuration that's going to be best for photography, because I think the top one is really just going to be too much overkill. The price is really just too high, and you're not really going to be utilizing the 64-core GPU anyway. Now, just seeing from this benchmark that I have done today, which is a lot of work, the result from this M1 Max, I'm inclined to think that I may not get this M1 Max in the studio to run the test because you're going to find out very soon that the result from this machine is very similar to the result that I have received from the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro that I have been extensively testing on my channel. Let me know your thoughts about this one. Do you think I should test the M1 Max with 32-core GPU? I'd like to hear about it. All right, and with that said, let's continue on with this and take a look at what are some of the systems that I'll be comparing this with. So the 6, 14, and 16-inch MacBook Pro. And I know these are a lot of laptops, and yes, many of them I have borrowed from my friends. I own a few of them that I'm using in my production, so it's pretty much a good mixture of things. And I'm also going to be including a result from 2 Intel machines. One of them is going to be the 2019 Mac Pro. This is the one with 12-core Xenon processor, and also a result from a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is pretty much right before they move over to the M1 Pro, M1 Max processor inside the machine. And I will also include the result from a M1 Mac Mini and also M1 MacBook Air. So you're going to be able to compare this machine to many ranges of Apple computer. Initial impression of this machine once I've done all these testing. Well, it really depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from an Intel Mac, this is an extremely great machine. It is extremely powerful. If you're coming from someone like me who has the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max 32-core GPU, well, the result of it is just like, okay, I've seen the way how the computer performs before. Granted, this is a base model. It represents a good value, but for me, I really want to be wowed with the performance, and I'm not really getting it with the M1 Max at the moment. So I'm hoping that the M1 Ultra is really going to wow me in terms of performance and really just make me impressed with the machine. But overall, like I said, it's a good machine for me. I'm a little jaded at this point. I'm not quite as impressed with the performance as I want to be. And there are a few things I found out about the machine too. We're going to talk about them. The first thing I want to address again and again is the fact that the apps that we use in photography just lack optimization for these M1 Pro, M1 Max, and also M1 Ultra. None of them really goes in and utilize the performance that these machines has to offer. So right now, what we're really doing is that we're taking a lot of power and we're throwing it at the application so that it can use it, not efficiently, but it's doing a really good job with it. Now, with this thinking in mind, just put this into perspective for just a moment. If the app performed this well already unoptimized, and we can get more power, for example, with the M1 Ultra, what are really the incentive for these software developers to really go in and optimize the app for these particular silicon? Is it really worth their time? Because when you try to optimize something, you're putting a lot of engineering hours and effort in to code that, to really optimize that. And it may gain, for example, 10, 20%. It may not be worth it. So that's the perspective to think about as you're configuring these machines. So I want to put that thought in your mind. The design, well, the way how I would put it is a few ways. It's like a double stack Mac Mini, or like 2.25 times a Mac Mini, which is sitting right next to it. It is a Mac Mini Pro or a Mac Pro Mini. Depending on how you want to look at it, it can go in multiple different ways, but it is a pretty good machine. It has a lot of ports on them, which is a good thing. And I want to point out a few things about the port. The HDMI, it is an HDMI 2.0. It's not a 2.1. So that also creates some limitation when you're trying to use the HDMI on this machine, and the HDMI out is limited to 4K only. There are a lot of other ports that you can use. The other thing that you may want to note as well is that there is a difference between the M1 Max and the M1 Ultra ports in front. So for the two USB-C or USB-C compatible type connector in front, on the M1 Max, you have a USB-C only that can go up to 10 gigabits per second. On the M1 Ultra, you get a Thunderbolt 4 that can go up to 40 gigabits per second. So there is a difference between these two configurations depending on what you need, and that's just something to be aware of. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the thermal. So the weight for this M1 Max, which has an aluminum cooler inside of it, is 5.9 pounds. On the M1 Ultra, it has a copper cooler, which is better at dissipating heat, and that one weighs 7.9 pounds. So it is 2 pounds more for that copper cooler, but that also introduces a good and a bad thing in a way. So the machine is heavier, but so far from what I've been hearing, from what people have been saying in the forum, is that the M1 Ultra is a really quiet machine, whereas this one, if I stop talking, I can pretty much hear the fan running. The fan is humming. This is reminding me of, for instance, the 2013 Mac Pro, the cylinder one, when I, for instance, use a program to modify the SMC and make the fan speed run faster so it cools the machine down. It sounds kind of like that. So I am not really thrilled with the fact that the fan is running all the time with this machine and you can really hear the fan running. I really want to sign this machine because so far in testing all the other M1s, for example, my laptop 14, 16-inch one, the Mac Mini M1, the iMac 24-inch M1, the MacBook Air. I mean, well, obviously MacBook Air doesn't have a fan, but anything that has a fan is generally really quiet and you have to push it really hard until the fan goes on. This one, you can just hear the fan right away. So I just want to share with you my thoughts on that. I'll also share with you my thoughts on the Ultra when I received that in too. The one great thing about these machines in general is that you get equal performance between desktop and laptop. There's no more performance differentiation, which is great. You have an Afterburner built in. So pretty much with the M1 Max, you have double the encoder-decoder engine of the M1 Pro, which is really just an awesome processor. I mean, it makes exporting video like a really hot knife cutting through butter, and it's just really great. So something to note about this computer is that it is BYODKM, and I put a T at the end, so it's pretty much bring your own display, keyboard, mouse, and trackpad if you want to use a trackpad. So choose wisely what you want to use. I highly recommend Logitech MX series because their keyboard, their mouse is ergonomically designed really well for creative pros, and it is something that I like. Now let's talk about display connection and calibration issues. Are there any? Well, so far I've been able to successfully do a software calibration with CalibRight and XRight devices. It works with this computer just fine. There's no problem whatsoever. However, when it comes to hardware calibration on BenQ SVU displays, I believe that we have to wait until Palette Master Element receives another update that is compatible with this machine, because so far in my multiple installation that I have created on this machine to run a test, every time I try to launch Palette Master Element, the machine just quit and there is an error. So hopefully we'll have a result or an answer from BenQ soon on that. Now let's talk about the numbers of display that you can link up to the system. For both of these, For the Max and Ultra, you can link up to 5 displays to the system. 4 of them can be the Apple Pro Display XDR to 6K, and then 1 of them can be via the HDMI port, which is the 4K out. So you can link up a lot of displays. And in fact, if you really think about this M1 Max inside the Mac Studio can output 1 additional display in comparison to the 16-inch with the M1 Max processor, or the 14-inch MacBook Pro for that matter. So something interesting to note there. That means that these chips in general have the capability to drive more displays. I think that port limitation is probably the biggest thing that you have on the MacBook Pro, and that's the reason why you're limited to only 4 display total instead of 5. I've also run a test with 4K at 144 Hz using USB Type-C. It works just fine. If you use the HDMI, that's not going to work. So just a little FYI there, but so far it works. You can also do a variable refresh rate where you go between, I think, 44 to 144 Hz, which I think is really awesome on these new Macs. So your build, what should you choose? How should you configure this? Well, one thing I want to remind you is that the components are non-upgradable. At least I think they're non-upgradable. Anyway, the SSD may be upgradable in the future. We don't know yet because there are no words from Apple about it. There has been some YouTubers, Mac Techs, that have taken apart that machine, and they have shown that there is an extra connection for the SSD on the machine, which is great, but we shall see what's going to happen down the road. Now, I also want to tell you, when you configure this machine, to really think more about the future needs. How much more are you going to use the machine? And the other thing, too, to counter thinking about the future need is also think about the apps that we have right now. How much more are they going to be optimized in the next, for example, 1, 2 to 5 years? And by that time, another machine will probably come along that are more powerful than this anyway, so you can throw more power at the application, and the software developer then have to wait and give it more time for them to optimize it. So just something to think about. As I always say, consider your future needs, but don't think about this as a future-proofing your purchase. You can only do so much with these machines. You can't really go in and really upgrade the components. You can't really change the processor or the chip package out anyway. It doesn't really matter much. Base configuration, I think, will work fine for most photography workflow, and that's something that I have advised in my other video too. But anyway, let's quickly talk about the CPU, GPU. So M1 Max, M1 Ultra is a SoC, a system on a chip. I'm just going to call it a SoC. That's the way how I'm going to say it, but we're going to go forward it. So the M1 Max, the current one that I have, has 10 core CPU. 8 of them are the high performance and 2 of them are the efficient core. We're going to talk about the M1 Ultra in another video when I get that machine in, because there's not a lot of point talking about it right now, but essentially it takes what the M1 Max has and it doubles it, which is really cool. SSD speed on this machine that I've run a test on, you're getting pretty good speed on these SSDs. And in fact, what I have done here is include this SSD speed, compare with a few of the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. You can see how the speeds are. Now, what's really somewhat disappointing for me in this regard is that the write speed is a little bit slower than, for example, the 14-inch MacBook Pro. It's not a big deal. It's a 512 gigabyte SSD, but that's just, something to keep in mind. Now, if you're configuring this machine, I would never configure more or buy more SSD capacity to get access to the higher speed, because you're never going to max this out anyway. With regards to the SSD itself, on the M1 Max, you can configure it with 512 gigabytes, but on the M1 Ultra, you don't have that option anymore. Apple did take that away. I kind of included that in my very first video saying, hey, by the way, if you're sneaky enough, you can do that, but you can't really do that anymore. The other thing to know is that I recommend, even though there is a slot on the inside of the machine that is a potential for an SSD upgrade, I would still recommend configuring a 1 terabyte SSD just so that you're just pretty much set and ready to go and you don't have to worry about, running out of space down the road or something like that. Personally, for me, I'm going to configure mine with 2 terabyte because I need more storage. With regards to the memory, well, you have 2 options. On the Max, you have 32 and 64 gigabytes of memory. On the Ultra, you have 64 and 128. I think 128 is going to be overkill for most photographers, unless you're constantly dealing with medium format files all the time and working in Photoshop. But, if that's your workflow, hey, more power to you, right? So the other thing I also found out about this Mac Studio is that there's no high power mode like in the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max SoC on the inside. And let's have a look at the benchmark results, starting with Lightroom Classic, which is a program that I use a lot. One-to-one preview for 1000 Nikon D850 file. This is the exact same file that I have used for all my tests for the past year and a half. So we can see the result right there coming up, and you can see that the Mac Studio M1 Max with the 24 GPU, it's pretty much performing in line with all the other machines. In fact, it's actually a little bit slower than the laptop counterpart, which I also find this kind of interesting. I mean, granted, it's about a minute and a half. It's not a big deal, but in my test that I have ran on this machine, it has not run faster than the laptop counterpart. And with this chart, I have also added in the result from the 2 Intel machine and also the 2 M1 at the very bottom. This is not really done in a way so that you can really see which machine is the fastest. What I want to really point out is the Mac Studio at the very top and also the other machines at the bottom so that you can compare them. But this is the format we're going to use going forward. And let's continue on with the export for 1000 Nikon D850 files. These are all just raw files that I'm bringing in. So the timing that you're seeing right now is pretty much in line with these other machines. It's not any faster. It's not any slower. In fact, some other machines could be up to like 30 seconds faster or 35 seconds faster. It really just depends. The timing is pretty much almost the same as the M1 Pro, M1 Max inside the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. It is still the same 10-core CPU. So what we're seeing, the way how this computer is behaving is exactly the same. There's no variation whatsoever. And this is the reason why I'm thinking that I don't really need to get in the M1 Max with 32 GPU into the studio, because the performance is going to be very similar to what you're seeing right now. This is what I'm hoping, is that when we get the M1 Ultra in, that this is going to be a true replacement for my Mac Pro. I'm really hoping so. Okay, continue on. Let's look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge, which is a CPU intensive task. For this one, we can see right now that the Mac Studio has done a pretty good job. It's pretty much in line with all the other Intel machines, and in fact, it is faster than the other machines, for instance, that have 32 gigabytes of RAM inside the system. And this is one of those tasks where if you have more RAM for the computer to do computation, it tends to be faster. For example, this one with 16 gigabytes of RAM, the M1 Pro, performs, takes the longest time to really perform this task. So if you can have more RAM in the system, I highly recommend configuring it that way. Let's now have a look at this compared to the Intel and M1 counterpart. You can compare the result there. And now let's have a look at Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. It's pretty much merging 14 Nikon D810 36 megapixel file to create a 314 megapixel DNG. This is a CPU and RAM based task, so it uses a lot of RAM in the system, and you can see that clearly. For instance, the machine with 64 gigabytes of memory performs the fastest, followed by the machine with 32 gigabytes of memory, and the one that takes the longest is the one with 16 gigabytes of memory. So just something to give you a perspective. If you do a lot of tasks with photo merging, if you work with large files a lot, you do a lot of localized image editing in Lightroom, I highly recommend consider upgrading your RAM to 64 gigabyte, because you can probably take advantage of that. And if you can, it's going to save you a lot of time when you have to work on so many of these files. If you just only work with these type of files every once in a while, well, it may not be worth it. So something to think about there. Here is it compare with the Intel and the M1 counterpart. Now let's have a look at Lightroom Cloud Version Export, which uses a lot of CPU and memory in combination. With this, the M1 Max result is at the very top, and it did take a minute and a half longer than the other Apple Silicon with similar configurations. This makes me really wonder and do a double take, so I've actually gone back and export the same file again numerous times to verify that the result is correct, and it is. Now, I can speculate as to why this may be happening, but I'm not really sure about the entire reason from it yet. But if we take a look at, for instance, Lightroom on the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max, we can see that the CPU core are being utilized fully, with some exception here and there on these last two core, but it's not really a big deal. You can also see that the utilization is pretty much peaking all the way as you're exporting the images. However, when we compare this result to the Mac Studio M1 Max, we're seeing a lot of these happening. That looks like a comb. That means that it's peaking, it's dropping, it's peaking, it's dropping, and you see that throughout the entire export process. I'm not really sure if this is related to optimization, if this is related to thermal, although, I mean, the machine is not really running that hot. The fan isn't running that much higher than it was before. However, the apps that I have right now can't really go in and find out and report back the thermal of the processor to me just because it's so new and they haven't built those plugins to the app yet. So we shall see. Anyway, here's the result of this compared to the other machines and also the Mac Pro. You can get an idea for how this one would perform. All right, let's now have a look at CaptureOne, which is another program that is photo intensive that utilizes a lot of the GPU on export and also creating previews in app. So with this in mind, let's have a look at the import. The import time for the Mac Studio is pretty much in line with all the other machines. And you can see that when I add in, for instance, the Intel and also the M1 computer, you can get an idea for how the machine performs against those. And moving on to CaptureOne Export. This is pretty much utilizing the GPU fully on the system, and we are going to start to see a variation. Now, the reason why I'm including this abbreviated chart is because this one includes the Mac Studio with 24 GPU, M1 Max laptop with 32 GPU, the 14-inch M1 Max with 24 GPU, and also a 14-inch M1 Pro with 16 GPU as a reference. As we can see right now, the 24 GPU version performs pretty much identical to each other. And if I end up getting the 32 GPU version, the M1 Max, into the studio, my guess is that the result is going to be very similar to that too. But if you take a look at this chart right now, all of this has nothing to do with the memory because the memory are exactly the same, including that one. There's no advantage getting the 32 GPU version, even for the most demanding photography app that uses GPU. So that's just my thought on that one. But here it is, the result compared to the other machines. And here it is, the result comparing it to other Intel and M1 computers. All right, let's now have a look at Photoshop. So for Photoshop, I am using Dick Lloyd Test, which he created a script and an action in Photoshop to run the test. It makes it much easier than going in there and using the brush and trying to figure this out every single time, because this is going to make the test extremely consistent. I'm using 3 of his tests to just kind of share with you the result. And yes, I will have another separate video later on in Photoshop and also in Lightroom, just kind of showing you how the program is maneuvering. Is it smooth? Is it lagging? Anything like that? We'll talk about that in like a separate video. All right. If we take a look at the Photoshop speed test, the Mac Studio is at the very top. I've done this test in 2 separate Photoshop RAM configuration. One of them is at 70%, the other one is at 90%, and pretty much it is within range for all the other machines. Nothing surprising there. Here it is when I add in the Intel and the M1 machine. Feel free to pause this again. A lot of information in these charts. This is a Photoshop medium file, 15.7 gigabytes. It's, pretty much more than majority of us would be really doing, but it gives us an idea for how the machine would perform. Apparently, there's a wild card on the 70% RAM where it takes much longer than the other counterpart machine. I haven't ran the test again yet. I might end up doing another test just to see how it runs, but when I bump up the RAM to 90%, the timing comes up to pretty much the same as all the other ones. So I wouldn't say that there's anything more impressive or less impressive about it. I think it's just pretty much baseline what we have expected so far. And here is the result, adding the Intel and also the M1. And lastly, this is the Photoshop Huge test, which works with file with 56 gigabytes. These are really large files that goes beyond any of us would really do, but I really want to see how this performs because it's really taxing the RAM quite a bit. You will see that right now on the machine with 64 gigabytes, it performs way better than any of these machines. However, the result from this one with 32 gigabytes, it performs pretty much the same as the 14-inch M1 Pro with 8 CPU, 14 GPU. That is the base M1 Pro in a 14-inch machine. And I'm expecting the result from this one to cluster closer to the M1 Pro, M1 Max, but it has not really been doing that. I've run this test a couple of times, and this is the lowest time so far. Not really sure what is going on, but there are some anomalies that's happening that's causing that. But again, if you're really working these large files, these machines are going to be more than fast enough and more than what you need. And here are some Final Cut Pro export results. Obviously, the timeline scrubbing and everything in Final Cut Pro is extremely smooth, but we can see that in H.264, this is a 4K clip from a Panasonic S1 exported to 4K. You can see that it's around 20 seconds shorter than all the other M1 Max machine. So we're seeing some marginal gains in the encoder-decoder engine that we're not really seeing on the laptop. But again, this is not something that really cuts down the time by quite a bit or significantly. I would say 20 seconds is good, but it's not anything to really run home about. I think that the M1 Ultra is going to really show us what the encoder and decoder engine can do when it doubles what M1 Max have, and I'm really looking forward to that. Obviously, the M1 Pro performs the same. It takes double the amount of time because there is half the amount of encoder-decoder on the chip itself. This is going to be a comparison between the Intel and also the M1. You can feel free to pause this. And this is the HEVC export. Again, a slightly shorter time, less than 20 seconds this time around, but nonetheless, it is showing that the efficiency is there, but it's not really being utilized in the CPU export task for the other program, which is somewhat disappointing in many regards. Anyway, let's have a look at this compared to the Intel and also the other M1's machine. And lastly, this is the ProRes Port22 export. And for some reason, the ProRes Port22 export for this one takes about the same amount of time as the M1 Pro. And this would lead us into the last portion where I recommend the best desktop Mac for Pro. Let me put it this way. If you're configuring a base Mac Studio with some minor upgrades here and there, for example, either in the memory or the SSD, you'll be good. You're going to have a machine that lasts for quite some time. That's going to take a while for the application developers, especially in the photography app, to really catch up anyway. But if you're someone like me who already own a Mac Pro who wants something that is the next level performance, obviously the M1 Max is definitely not the answer. And you may want to look at, for example, the M1 Ultra. And I'm really hoping that the M1 Ultra will blow me away because the M1 Max so far in my testing, even on a laptop, they're great machines, don't get me wrong. But for me, I'm a little jaded and I like to see more performance from them. Now, let me put it this way. If you're coming from an iMac from 2012, 2015, or even just the later generation iMacs that run on Intel, the 27-inch one, you're going to find that these machines perform really flawlessly and are going to do a really great job. If you're coming from an Intel, for instance, MacBook Pro, oh my goodness, these machines are going to blow those machines out of water right away. You already have seen some of the results. So everything is all relative, and it's all relative to what you need. The other thing I will also say is that I call myself a pro photographer because I photograph for a living. I do wedding events, and I also do a lot of commercial and architecture shoot. I photograph in RAW, so I'm constantly dealing with large files all the time in the 40, 50 megapixels. If you're someone like me, then you may want more power, and considering the M1 Ultra may be an option, especially if your budget would allow that, because the metrics that I measure time when I'm editing my images is in seconds and minutes, not in minutes and hours or in hours and days, because everything starts to compound and add up. Let me give you this analogy. For instance, let's say you come back from an event and you have to deliver 1,200 images. If you take just 1 second to edit each of those 1,200 images, you're going to spend around 20 minutes of your time editing them. Now, if that task on a machine that's slower takes 3 seconds to do, you're now taking about an hour of your time up. Start adding things up, and we start to compound time in ways you may not want to think about. So having a computer that can run that much faster is going to be a tool that's going to help you achieve and do other things in life. Go out and photograph more, spend more time with your family, do other things. So ultimately, what we're really doing with these machines is that we're trading our money in to buy time. And that's what we're really doing at the end of the day. Considering what you may need is definitely going to be important because let me put it this way. There are pro photographers out there who does wedding and event and they shoot JPEG. And definitely they may not need this kind of power at all to run their image processing because guess what? The other machines, the M1, are going to go through those images just fine. So ultimately think about the workflow that you have and the type of work that you do. With regards to the CPU and GPU in general, like I said, it depends on where you're coming from. Everything is all relative. If you're coming from the Intel machine and you don't have a Mac Pro or a Mac Pro 2019 for that matter, the M1 Max is going to do an amazing job. But if you have a Mac Pro 2019 and you have one with 12 core or above, then you may want to look at getting the M1 Ultra to get the most performance out of that. Now, even with that, for photographers, my recommendation still remains the same, that I think the sweet spot for this is the 48 core and that the 64 core GPU version there's no app out there in photography right now that can take advantage of that. And it will be a while before even CaptureOne release an update that really will utilize the 48 or 64 core GPU on these M1 SoCs. So anyway, that's a thought on the CPU GPU. With regards to the RAM, you have two options. On the Max, you have 32 and 64. On the Ultra, you have 64 and 128. So if you're configuring a Max, I think that going between 32 and 64 is perfectly fine. If you do a lot of work with large files, you do panoramic merge, and you want to maximize your time spending in front of the computer, I recommend upgrading it to 64 gigabyte. Yes, it is $400. You can't upgrade the RAM afterwards. That is something is assured because it's integrated into the CPU, the GPU itself. It is unified memory, so configure what you need now. If you are looking at the M1 Ultra, I think that for most photographers, even the most demanding ones, 64 gigabytes of memory should be more than enough. Unless you can really find a justification to use 128 gigabytes, I think 64 is definitely a perfect sweet spot for the M1 Ultra for pro photographers. Here's the thing though, I would recommend that you do this. If you're not sure how much memory you're going to need, launch Activity Monitor if you don't have a statistic app menu or something like that. And just have it running for the day while you're editing, running in the background. And at the end of a day or at the end of a few days, if you don't restart your machine, go in and look at the memory pressure and see if it's green all the way. If it's constantly still green, that means you're perfectly fine with the amount of memory that you have. And let's say you have 16 right now and it's in the yellow, you may want to go to 32. So if this is showing yellow or is showing red, it just tells you that you probably want to consider getting more memory, because at the end of the day, yes, it is unified memory, but it's also shared between the CPU and the GPU. And also, what it comes down to at the end of the day, if you need more memory, you just need more memory. It can't just make memory out of thin air. Anyway, if you have a program like myself, for example, I use iStat Menu, which I really love. I'll leave a link to their website in the description below. It will give you the memory pressure. It will tell you how much memory you're using, and it will also keep stats up to 30 days. So you can see that this past 30 days from a Mac Pro, I almost reached 50% of memory a few times. And on this machine, I have 96 gigabytes of memory. So obviously this is telling me that I have memory that is way too much, more so than I ever needed. And chances are I'm probably going to be okay with a 64 gigabyte machine. So I hope that helps you out a little bit in figuring out how much memory you need. So rather than listening to what I'm recommending or what other people are recommending for memory, just look at your habits and the way how you're using the machine. SSD. This is one of those things where there is a slot to upgrade it. MaxTex have shown us that, but I'm not sure how that's going to work yet. I'm not sure if Apple is going to lock that and you have to use the Apple configurator to upgrade. Will this be only compatible with Apple SSD and not third-party one? For example, let's say OWC creates one. How long would it take for them to develop it? And will it even be compatible with the system? So there's a lot of questions right now. If you're configuring a machine today or in the near future, I would just say get the SSD size that you need now, and you don't have to worry about like, oh no, I have to expand or I have to link extra drive in the system. And having the internal SSD is good for, a few reasons. For instance, the app that you're running, the app that you're going to install in the system. Granted, you may say you're probably not using up to 1 terabyte. That's true, but everything else that you do in the system, the file that you download temporarily, the emails app that you use, if you use the mail app, for instance, all stored on the local machine. So having a little bit more doesn't really hurt. And I highly recommend just paying the extra $200 and upgrading it to at least 1 terabyte. That's going to do you wonders. Anyway, this has been the first Mac Studio review. This is the base model. I know I've covered so much information in this video. If you stay to the end, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time watching my videos and just hanging out with me. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this video a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new. And remember, in art we trust.